This was called regenerative agriculture, right? So regenerative agriculture is the future of farming, I truly believe. A number of practices go into or can be applied to attain certain goals. Certain principles unify regenerative systems. When these principles are in place, they work every single time. But you have to figure out the practices in order to make them work. You have to tweak these systems to adapt it to your own place. Regenerative ag is not technology intensive, it's knowledge intensive. It's much different. Okay? What are the principles? Number one, you need to stop tilling your soil. I think that tillage is more damaging to biodiversity on your farm than herbicides are. Never leave bare soil. There should always be living roots in the ground. Okay? Fallow is a myth. Some plant diversity is better than none, and more is better than less. And there's a lot of ways to get plants into your system that are agronomically sound. Okay? And then we have to be reunifying our farms. We need to stop siloing our different components of a functional system. We need to get livestock and crops in the same place at the same time. When a system is developed, I mean, I've seen these things work from arid deserts to the tropics, right? As long as these principles are adhered to and understood that this is the goal. This is Claire. She was a master's student. And what Claire did is, well, this is already published now. What Claire did was kind of put the topper on about 10 or 15 years worth of research that we were doing in cornfields, of which you've already seen some of that information. What she did is attempt to validate what these farmers were doing. Okay, so what we did is we went to the top regenerative farmers in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska. And we said, point us to your corn phase of your rotation. And they did, and we sampled the hell out of it. Okay? And then we said, point us to a neighbor who's farming corn really well, all right, conventionally. And they did, and we went and sampled that. So this was farmer-developed systems. This is not a research farm where, some scientists come out there and they're like, okay, well, this is the best management practice, and this is the best management practice, and this is going to work, and this is how everybody should be doing it, right? This is the farmers over sometimes decades have developed functional systems, tested them out, validated them, and now we have to learn from them, all right? Regional focus, and we focus on systems, not, all right, I'm the entomologist, I'm going to just look at insects, and then we better get, a weed guy over here, and the weed guy will work on weeds, and then we'll get a plant pathologist, and that guy will work over there. This was a systems level. We wanted to examine the functional unit was the system. Practices varied, principles did not, but there were some universal practices that helped us to define these two systems. The regenerative cornfields did not use insecticides. All of the conventional fields had Bt corn and used neonicotinoid seed treatments. Yields a little bit lower in the regenerative fields, but the profits were twice as high. And there was reasons for that. Number one, these farmers weren't spending so much on fertilizers. These regenerative farmers weren't spending so much on seed because they weren't buying all the genetically modified traits. And number three, these farmers were marketing their products differently. Some of them received organic premiums, but not all of them. And even if they didn't receive those premiums, they didn't lose money
by going at regenerative. So we wanted to know whether yields were associated with the profitability of each of these farms. And we found that there was no correlation when we did the analysis. Each dot is a cornfield on this graph. And what this graph shows is that profit increases as the organic matter in the soil increases. A well-trained monkey can grow 300 bushel corn if he buys enough junk, okay? It costs money to get those yields. And unless you're counteracting that with increased profitability, it doesn't pay. And what we're finding is that these farmers that are investing in soil health are the ones that are reaping the greater profits. So why do we give a prize for the greatest yielding cornfields in a county, right? We should be giving a prize to the folks that are growing the most soil. What a concept that would be. How much would that change everything? Our current approach to agriculture isn't working. Okay. Our current approach to science isn't working in agriculture. Beekeeping isn't working. All of these things. There's a lot of problems right now that we're facing. And the status quo isn't getting us where we need to be anymore. I was reached out to by one of the land grant university presidents, and he said, "John, you're a little hard on research. You're hard on science, and that's maybe detrimental because as a land grant, we invest in conservation agriculture." Yeah, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I live right here. There's a lot of green and there's a lot of yellow, right? And I thought about that statement a lot, and I drive through this. Green is soybeans and yellow is corn, right? Where once there was hundreds of species, now there's two. Um, and morally and ethically, and I don't, I mean, corn and beans are great, right? That we could grow those. That's an important part of a functional farm. That's wonderful. Overinvestment in them, though, is a problem. And until until a president of the university says, what's happened is morally and ethically wrong, and we're going to devote the resources that we have to fixing that, well, that's when the land grant university mandates will be realized again. And until that happens, the answers are going to have to be motivated by little punchy places like Igdisis Foundation that are trying to do science to support this. There are consequences to this. So most of this ground that you're seeing right there is treated with neonicotinoids. It's a seed treatment on corn. One of our friends out in Montana reached out a few years back. She said the hunter-killed deer were having problems. They didn't look right. 70% of the deer had in this area of Montana had these jaw deformities, and 70% of the males ended up having genital deformities that hadn't been seen before. So she was interested in whether or not neonics were partially to blame for that. And so we got some money to study that. Elise Hughes Burheim was our graduate student. John Jenks was the faculty advisor, and I helped on some of this work with the tox assays. Really, really challenging piece of work this was, and it'll never be repeated again. It was a captive bred deer study where we administered imidacloprid, which is one of these neonics, directly to the deer in the water, and we monitored those deer over 2 generations. Really challenging work. What we ended up seeing, the spleen ended up being the organ. She looked at milk, blood, liver, brain, spleen, and looked at the levels of neonicotinoid that were in those animals. and then we correlated them with certain fitness responses or like how the deer was doing. The amount of imidacloprid in the spleens of the dead fawns was significantly higher. I think that that's an important correlation. Additionally, the more imidacloprid that you have in these spleens, it was associated with lower body weight in the fawns. They were smaller organs, thyroid hormone levels. Yeah, it's messing up the hormones in these deer. Fawn jawbone length, that sounds familiar. Activity levels, the deer were slower when they were fed neonicotinoids. What's a slow deer in the wild? Dead deer. Yeah, a lot of issues there, right? This is an insecticide. It's not supposed to hurt deer. Not supposed to hurt us. But there you have it. Okay, that's what we were able to generate in the lab. You were force feeding, John, you were force feeding these deer imidacloprid. Of course you're going to see problems, right? So this was the amount of deer imidacloprid that we were able to generate in our captive bred deer. And North Dakota Game Fish and Park sent us a bunch of spleens of hunter-killed deer throughout North Dakota. They had 3 times the amount that we were able to generate under our controlled conditions. What are we doing? The neonics aren't helping farmers, right? There's no economic need for neonicotinoid seed treatments on field crop seeds. In one of the more brilliant marketing ploys ever perpetrated on the farming community, the insecticide companies created a problem that wasn't there, and then they sold the solution to it. Brilliant, brilliant idea. But look at the consequences of it. Learning disabilities in the bees, hormone disruptions in mammals, eating disorders, food intolerances. Do these things sound familiar? My parents have 9 grandkids. 4 of them have severe autism. We grew up in Minnesota, just south of Minneapolis. Let's connect the dots here, people. Let's connect the dots. This is the battle of our time. How did this happen? How did this happen? There's a lot of different reasons for that. I think one of them, we've got good data, right? Regenerative agriculture seems to work. The science is there. There's also science that says that, neonicotinoids are having environmental impacts, right? Okay. So these things, yeah. So why do we keep going down this road? There's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to focus on one of them, and I'm going to focus on the science side. This is humbling to say as a scientist. Science isn't black and white. It's gray. There's never been a perfect scientific study. There's always problems with them. And all it takes is just one study to disprove what we think we know. It all depends on how you ask the question. And the question formulation is a really essential part of science. And oftentimes it's done poorly, without observation. So, as a younger man, I was seeking truth. I was really looking for answers. And I thought science could give me those things, but it doesn't. It doesn't give truth. What it gives you is a formula for assessing, potential truths. And I think it's very valuable in that. But science is fallible. Science is also manipulated. The tobacco industry ended up formulating this a long time ago. They did a wonderful job. How on earth did they convince us for so many years that these little, that tobacco, cigarettes didn't cause human health problems? Well, there's a great movie on Netflix called Merchants of Doubt. There's also a book by Naomi Oreskes that was the instigator for that documentary. The book's a little thick, but it's rich with details. What happens here? Okay. You have an agenda, right? And some science comes out that says that your agenda isn't true, or that that's contrary to what your agenda is. Well, there's science isn't black and white, it's gray. There's always problems with studies. Discredit it, right? You just poke some holes in that science. You show that the science wasn't done correctly, or that there's problems with it. And pretty soon it looks like it's junk, right? When in reality, it's not. Oftentimes it's not. So if science is gray and it's not black and white, how do we make decisions based on science? Well, you rely on a preponderance of evidence. And that preponderance of evidence, you repeat that science, that study, multiple times over various circumstances, and hopefully there becomes a consilience of evidence that ends up arising from that. And when that happens, you can start making some decisions. Okay, you can start making policies or farm management decisions. Where does a preponderance of evidence come from? Science is expensive. Who's got the biggest pockets in the room? The deepest pockets? The large corporations often do. And so when they want to obscure the scientific data, they just fund research that supports their proposal or their product. But you still have problems, right? Because there's still a couple of noisy idealists out there that are still doing work on this. Okay, you destroy that scientist, right? You destroy their laboratories, you destroy everybody that they care about, and you put their corpse on a stake for everybody to see, and nobody ever does that work again. There is no incentive for a scientist to study controversial issues. I get paid the same whether or not I'm counting lady beetle spots or I'm investigating climate change, right? Science really needs to start to readjust. It needs to stop being symptom focused, in agriculture at least, and focus on the root causes. We need to start revising how grant funds are distributed. This is me. Younger man, had a little more hair back then. I was on top of the world, right? Worked for the USDA, met the president in the White House, was named one of the top young scientists in the country. Everything was going right. I had students and postdocs galore. I had a puppy mill going. That was great. They were just pumping out, right? Get those students through. Publications. I had more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, wrote my first book by the age of 30. Millions of grants. I was advising the EPA on risk assessments of pesticides and genetically modified crops, European Food Safety Authority, Brazilian government. It was great. And then I started asking the wrong questions. The beekeepers came to me and they said, John, our bees are dying and the pesticides are killing them. And I said, the science isn't black and white, the science is gray. It doesn't support the fact that pesticides are the only factor that are killing your bees. And they told me, come on out, look at our hives and watch our bees die as a result of a spray that's being done right next door or planting corn. And that was different, right? That wasn't me reading the scientific literature. That was me being exposed directly to the problems and connecting with it. And we started doing science, and sure enough, the pesticides were killing the bees. They are killing the bees. And then the regenerative agriculture scene started popping up. And these farmers were saying, you know what, we're not using pesticides anymore. We use maybe a third of the fertilizers, and we've got the same crops and everything. I'm like, that's not supposed to happen. You're doing things that science says can't happen on your farms. They said, come on out and take a look. And I did. And they were right. And we started doing our science in ways that showed, you know what? They've got something here. And everything changed when I started asking these questions. Everything changed. And eventually they started to suppress the science that we were generating, despite peer review and everything. I mean, I was buttoned up tight on these studies, but it was inconvenient results. And so they started to force me to take my name off of the research, and harassing, and everything started going down the tubes. And I really had to ask this question of myself of why on earth did I get into this to begin with? Because, you know, if I wanted to do good science, if I was just doing science for science's sake, I should be asking different questions. And I decided at that point in my life that I was doing science for something bigger than that. And then, in fact, we were facing some serious problems as a planet and as a farming community right now. And we need people asking these questions. And so I quit. And I quit noisy. Front page of the Washington Post. Called them out. You're not allowed to suppress science just because you don't like the result. And yeah, that ended up prompting an investigation within the USDA of political interference in science, and they surveyed all of their scientific staff within agriculture. And they came back and they were really proud. They were like, only 10% of our scientists have experienced political suppression of research. Only 10%. That's barely anything. They have 2,000 scientists. 200 of them had gone through the exact same thing that I did and didn't do anything about it. It's not just at the USDA. This happens at the universities regularly. This happens throughout most research institutions. So I quit. That star is where I live right now. This is an operating regenerative farm called Blue Dasher Farm in eastern South Dakota, ground zero of where I think change really needs to start happening. Yeah, we're expanded into California at this point. This is an old slide, I guess. We wanted to rethink how science was applied in order to help usher in an evolutionary shift to our food system. You know, metrics and this was interesting to me. I started to make a laundry list of all of the things that made me a good scientist. And we all have these in our lives, right? I mean, students, what are your things that make you a good student? Grades, attendance, all of these things, right? Farmers, what makes you yields? Definitely profitability, number of trucks you got in your yard, how big your grain bins are. Those are all wonderful metrics of success, right? Well, scientists have those too. We have scientific peer-reviewed papers, right? Publish or perish. How many millions did you get last year? Grad students, how many people did you pump through the puppy mill? Not really thinking about what their career is going to be like. How many committees did you serve on? And the only way that you get a job in science is by doing these things. And so it's a self-perpetuating system. And I looked at this list and I started to ask myself, how many of these things that I am assessing my quality based on do farmers care about? Zero. And so we changed the list. How many lives have we touched? How many face-to-face contacts have we had? How many acres have we changed at Dices Foundation? What's our media reach? How many people have seen the science and understood it and asked questions about it? And yeah, peer-reviewed science is on that list, but it isn't at the top. What's so exciting to me now and what gives me so much hope is these farmers that we're experiencing that are changing everything. all around the world, it's called regenerative agriculture. And they didn't know they were called regenerative farmers when they got started on this thing, but they're showing us things that science says can't be happening. Um, Nothing is possible, right? Until somebody does it. And then it suddenly becomes possible for everybody else to follow suit. And these trailblazers have been really influential. Yeah, we're sort of faced with this question, is a farm regenerative or not? And so scientifically, and there's a lot of labeling schemes and certification programs that are popping up all over the place right now. None of them have any data behind them, right? Nobody's actually generating like, okay, well, if you followed this, then you get this much more carbon. Or if you follow this certification scheme, you have this more life on your farm, or farmer wellness increases, or all of these other things. They're all created behind a computer at this point. The only system that does is ours, and it's free, and we give it away. And you can pretty well know within 9 or 10 yes and no questions where you fit on the regenerative spectrum, and even make some assertions about what you might expect to see in some of these regenerative outcomes, like carbon sequestration or life or profit. So really useful system. And it's published here. We could talk more about it. Well, we will talk more about it, but in the context of this 1,000 Farms initiative that we're getting going right now. So we need bold action, right? And at the trough of COVID, I had some time on my hands, and so I sat down and I said, you know what, we need bold action to get ourselves out of this mess. Really, the answer to COVID is our food system. The answer to many of these planetary scales is our food system, growing nutritious food, connecting with the natural world, connecting with families and community again. These are really essential solutions. And I said, well, Ecdysis is a group of scientists, right? We're working in a pole shed in the middle of eastern South Dakota, grassroots science. What can we do? And so I proposed the largest agricultural experiment that's ever been tried. And we're calling it the 1,000 Farms Initiative. It'll at its terminus will be much larger than 1,000 farms, but yeah, we're getting there. It's hard to change the letterhead every time you add a farm, so we just went with 1,000. The goals of this project are simple. Does regenerative agriculture work, no matter what you grow and where you grow it? Farmers are figuring this out. They're developing successful systems. How are they doing that? Can we empirically tease out certain approaches that help that transition process to ease their way in, so that new farmers don't have to experience the same challenges that the trailblazers did? This is almonds in California. This is not photoshopped. On the right is most of the Central Valley of California. On the left is a regenerative agriculture almond orchard. You could see the difference, right? When we started this project at the beginning of 2022, we needed to recruit farms. We give them $7,500 worth of free information about their farm, but we needed to, get them on board. And so we just put out an email. Within a couple of months, we had more than 1,000 farms already registered to be a part of this study. If you start thinking about those numbers, if traditional marketing conversion rates apply to this email campaign, 1% of a population clicks on a link. And if that's true, then we could have tens of thousands of regenerative farms currently already in operation in the United States, kind of flying under the radar screen. So I think it is an interesting, it's not hard numbers here, but I do think that there's a pattern there that's worth digging in a little deeper on. Two types of farms that we want to be participating in this study. Number one, established farms. You've got a system that you're proud of, that you're working on, and that has been in that system for at least 3 years. And then we're also interested in folks that are just getting in this game. Maybe it's just a field on your farm that you're trying it out on. And then we can revisit those fields in multiple years to see how the changes are happening. For inclusion in this study, this is a logistical nightmare, right? Okay, so I'll show you a map. It's really challenging. We can't sample every farm, but we try to get folks that can get their communities together into forming clusters. That makes our job a lot easier. So we're looking for leaders in regenerative agriculture. They can tell us what's possible in these systems. We're looking for dominant food systems. Central Valley, if we turn almonds, we turn the whole Central Valley into regenerative, okay? So it has these trickle-down effects. Underrepresented groups are really well represented in our study. And then this study provides this continental scaffolding for calibrating new modeling techniques for understanding how sustainable agriculture or conservation practices ends up affecting the environment and the community. So yeah, really powerful opportunity, and we allow those collaborations to kind of help us to guide where it is that we end up settling on our farms. So this is where we were in 2022. Our teams deployed from South Dakota out to 400 farms across the United States, 15 states. Really, yeah, powerful data sets that we've been able to generate right now off of this. But as you can imagine, getting scientific teams of 8 to 10 people to each of these different locations to visit the farms, to shake their hands, to meet the families, to talk about what it is that they're experiencing in their operations, that becomes a real challenge. And so logistically, this has been a really a fascinating project. These are the systems that we studied in 2022: almonds, vineyards, cherries, lots of stuff. Okay, and we were all over the country. It's interesting to watch how compartmentalized our food system has become. Almonds, most of the world's almonds come from this little valley in California. Most of the country's apples and cherries come from the Columbia River Basin in Washington. That ends up becoming kind of brittle. There's a lot of risks. So when we see winter weather patterns, tornadoes in the Central Valley during blossom, there's no nuts that come out for the world, right? It shuts it down. So there is something to be said for resilience in terms of diversifying. Soils, we go deep carbon on these, down 60 centimeters. Our team dug 20,000 soil cores last year. That's a lot. Looking at the physical chemical properties of these soils, we are creating a soils archive that'll be housed at Blue Dasher Farm of our nation's food system, so that in 20, 30 years, we can go back to those original soils and see how things have changed. Yeah, all of these different characteristics, the soil is the key, okay? For croplands last year, this is what we found. On the bottom axis is the number of regenerative practices that we end up seeing. Total soil carbon is on the y-axis there, the left axis. The more regenerative practices that farms across the country are employing, the more organic matter they're growing in their soil, by about 1%, which is, you're like, oh, 1%, that's not very much, right? No, for every percent of organic matter, you get 20,000 more gallons of water that soil can handle. You get 8 tons of carbon that's stored in the top of that soil column. Okay, when you extrapolate that out, I mean, that takes care of our carbon emissions. Okay. We see a lot more noise in the red circle, right, than we do on the blue circle. That's because in the blue circle, those are conventional farms. The nice thing about a conventional system is when you go in, you buy the bag of seed, you know what you're going to get at the end of the year. If you check all of the boxes, usually you end up with a pretty predictable product. In regenerative systems, that's not there yet. There's a lot more variability down there, but to me, that's the exciting area. What we end up seeing is that some of these farms are generating a tremendous amount of carbon on their operations in ways that we've never seen in science before. And so if we could tease out the practices that are generating those, that gives us a really powerful tool for combating some of the planetary scale problems that we're facing right now. I see a question in the chat. How are you defining the level of regenerative here? Is soil texture taken into account? So this is the first great question. There's a whole talk on how we're defining it. We ask a series of questions based on practices that end up defining where a farm fits along those spectrums. So this is a series of 8 or 9 yes or no questions. Did you till? Did you plant cover crops? Did you use synthetic fertilizers? Did you graze it? Did you use compost? These are the questions that we're asking. And so the definition down, or the number that there is generated on that x-axis ends up becoming a conglomeration of different practices. They could get to that number 6 using a variety of approaches. And then soil texture ultimately will be included in that. This was just a first shot across the bow as far as analyzing the data to look for changes. Region, food system, I expect this graph to be noisy because it's got like 270 data points from all over a continent. And so, yes, we'll put all of those cofactors in there. Rainfall is actually, I think, going to be a really big driver of this. But this gives you at least an initial idea of what we're kind of seeing as on a national level. Water infiltration. Wars will be fought over water next. California Central Valley, they're turning the spigots off, right? That's going to turn, each nut requires 2 gallons of water to produce. Each nut, 2 gallons. And they're farming it in what has become a desert because of our agricultural practices. The Ogallala aquifer that runs over much of the Western Plains, that's almost dry, okay? They're draining it. We need a different approach. How fast does the water go in? So we did 1,200 water infiltration ring tests. That's one of our approaches for measuring the water dynamics with the soils. This is data just from Boulder County, one of our clusters. This is one of the more arid areas of the country. It's fed by flood irrigation, or it's fed by flood irrigation from the mountains. It comes down, and what we see is that they've been able to attain some pretty remarkable things as far as water infill rates are concerned. So it's not always about how much water you get when you're in an arid environment. It's how much you can hold on to. Microbial communities, we currently have sequenced about 3,500 different bacterial species, as well as about 4,000 species of fungi on these agricultural soils. This will be one of the largest databases of soil in microbiology that's in existence. Haney Soil Health Test Score accommodates some of that, so you see it increases. Okay, so we see this with PLFA as well, which is phospholipid fatty acids. So we try to use redundant methods in each of these parameters because there's caveats to interpreting each of these different approaches or sampling techniques. And so we try to use at least 2 different approaches for each. Plant community, we did 31,000 plant biomass samples last year. We're looking at green cover, total cover percentages. We're hoping to get an herbarium and a DNA fingerprinting going on to identify all of these plants. Yeah, the more regenerative practices you employ, the more plant species you have. And that's important because a lot of the diversity of life on your fields is driven by how many plant species are there. The productivity of a piece of ground for a farm doesn't come from a jug. It comes from the sun. And the only way you catch that energy is with plants. So plant diversity becomes a really important tool for farmers. Invertebrates. We just identified our 1 millionth insect, and we're developing artificial intelligence in order to identify the next million. So we're training our system to recognize invertebrate images, and so this will unlock the field of entomology in a lot of ways. We did about 78,000 insect sweeps last year, and we're keeping an invertebrate collection housed, a museum quality collection that's all digitized and housed here at Blue Dasher Farm of our nation's food system, the invertebrates there. We end up seeing these little guys. So we're also looking at not just how many critters are out there, but what they're doing. And so we were a part of a project up in the Canadian prairies to see how fast ecosystem functions end up returning once farms go regenerative. So this is up in Manitoba and Saskatchewan over a 3-year process. And one of the ecosystem services is how many critters they eat, okay? How many pests they eat. So to test for this, we use these little caterpillars, wax moths. You get them as bait, especially for ice fishermen over there in Minnesota. You can buy these little wax moth larvae, and then we put a pin through their butts and we put them into the field, and we check on them after an hour to see how many of them have been eaten. And it's a really nice surrogate for biological control that's going on in these different fields. So here you see a picture of an ant, or ants just going to town on one of those caterpillars. What we see is that the ecosystem heals itself very quickly in regenerative systems. So in the first year, we saw only like 25% of these caterpillars got eaten in an hour. By year 1 or of the transition, though, that had doubled. And by year 2, it had tripled. 75% of these caterpillars are eaten within 1 hour of hitting the ground. At that level, you just don't need insecticides anymore. So that's one of the ways that these work. Birds. We've got one of the best ornithologists in the world who joined our team, and his name's Casey Jensen, and he's training us in. We're also looking into sensors that can listen for birds in these different habitats and use that as an approach for quantifying bird communities. But just in almonds in the first year of the study, and we've got years 2 and 3 now, but I haven't analyzed the data, we've got about a 30% increase. I think that that's increased. It was at least double in the regenerative fields this year compared to conventional fields when we were out in almonds this last week. Regenerative systems need to produce healthier food, and we're measuring that too. So we collected yield samples and forage samples across the United States. We're getting a battery of nutrients in each of those samples. And then we're partnering with the American Heart Association and Rockefeller Foundation, who are initiating the Periodic Table of Food Initiative to help to quantify the nutrient densities of foods across the world. So they're looking at 1,700 different phytochemicals associated with each of these yield samples. And we've got it for wheat, almonds, and apples. They're doing those analyses for us. And we'll be able to tie those nutritional assessments back to the metadata on practices that are being generated. So really exciting work that's being done there through that collaboration. And then we're also looking at the economics and the management. Um, the net profitability. So right now it looks like these farms are the regenerative farms in the two systems we've analyzed is corn and almonds. They're about twice as high. And a lot of times that's generated by premiums that are associated with the yield. So like an organic premium or a regenerative premium. But a lot of times that's also even without those premiums, you don't lose money by going regenerative by the sounds or by the data. We're also looking at water use, at chemical use. We should be able to do carbon life cycle assessments on each of these farms as a result. So pretty exciting work. What we end up seeing in these is, I had these overarching questions, but we're planning on pivoting a little bit and trying to use Thousand Farms to dig a little deeper in each of these different ecoregions. So like perenniality and wheat, we've got Kernza, but there's also Salish Blue coming on right now that we're really excited about, and we're going to try to focus some of our work on assessing the impacts of that. Intercropping in the Northern Plains, really powerful, but crop insurance, everybody in a county could lose their crop one year. But if you planted an intercrop, two crop species grown together, you don't get an insurance check and everybody else does. That isn't fair, and we're going to use our data to help battle that. Multi-species herds, bison production in the Dakotas. Man, some of the best pastures we visited had bison on. So maybe there's something there that we could start digging into. How do you use compost at scale? Maybe it's through some of these compost teas and seed dressings. So we can assess some of those things while looking at these overarching questions of whether or not regenerative agriculture works. Question from the class: when you're comparing regenerative versus conventional, what is the cutoff? So what we end up doing is we kind of look at the data. A lot of times there's a trough in the middle. You don't survive. There's a valley of death within our food systems, where you have to make a decision. You don't get to just tip a toe in with regenerative agriculture. You can't just go no-till and experience the full benefits. You can't just use cover crops. It's a system that we have to try to identify here and to develop, all right? And if you only adopt a couple of practices, you don't survive for very long. You have to make a choice. Either you go back to conventional or you go back to regenerative. And so that placement is right around for croplands about 3 or 4. Depends on the system. That's kind of our cutoff. And that's, yeah, so we try to use the data in order to influence where that cutoff should be. All right, almost through it. Okay. So we've done a lot of stuff, right? Gosh, it just seems like we're up against so much right now. Every day we are bombarded. We're just hit constantly with all of the problems that we're up against. And at some point, you just throw your hands up in the air, right? And you're like, there's nothing I can do about this anymore. And so, yeah. At Ecdysis, we believe that all it takes is one pebble to start an avalanche. And in that room of farmers right now, and in that room of students, I see a lot of pebbles, okay? So use your own lives to be part of this change. There's a lot of hope right now. The farmers in that room give me so much hope. Okay, we're gonna get out of this mess. And here's our crazy staff. We're up to about 35 right now. We're hiring on another 10. Spread the word, please. And a lot of the folks that are helping us to conduct this massive project. Yep, there's our handles. Yep, you can look us up and see what we're up to. A lot of our research is displayed on Facebook and Twitter. So, and with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and we can maybe open it up, at least initially, for some questions and thoughts if people have them.
Okay, Dr. Mulder, one question I have, this is Holly again with the Soil and Water, is you mentioned that predator-prey balance in a regenerative system. If you had to quantify that, I know there's so many variables at play, but as a farmer is transitioning more to regenerative practices, what kind of timeline could they expect before they would see that balance in the predator-prey environment and be able to step away from some of those insecticides?
What we end up seeing is, so you saw a lot of the response variables that we end up measuring there, right? So carbon or water infiltration or life accrual or profits or whatever. What we end up seeing on these different fields is that the change happens really soon, like within a year, you start seeing the change. But what we don't see is that, you know, the longer you're in it, you don't, or the more practices that you end up putting into that system, you don't start to see this asymptote, right? You don't see it flatlining like, okay, if I've got 17 species in my cover crop, we're good to go. We have not observed what is possible yet within these food systems. And that to me is really exciting. So, answer to your question, you start seeing benefits within 1 year. Generally, those benefits continue to accrue the longer that you're in it.
Obviously, this is a large study. What are your longitudinal plans? How many years do you have to have funding to do these longitudinal plans, and what will be some of the reports?
Yeah. So what this project is, I mean, this is relationship. This is a whole different branch of science than what's normal. And the goals of it are a little bit different. You know, we're not just kind of like, okay, we're done. Yeah, we tested that hypothesis and now we're finished, right? We're using our science to kind of drive change. And that doesn't mean that we don't allow the data to guide that, right? This is robust scientific research. But an important outcome of it is also, you know, the data can be an equalizer. And so you go into very conventional farming situations and everybody respects that data. And we're not, this isn't a gotcha kind of a thing, right? We're trying to learn from everybody and respect where everybody's at along that continuum of very conventional, very regenerative in order to float all boats. What is our plan? This year we'll be expanding geographically. We'll be revisiting a lot of the places that we were last year because of this idea of that we want to establish relationships and presence within each of these different food systems. And so year one is sort of this beachhead, right? We get in there, we start to develop these relationships, we meet who the leaders are in the community. Year two, we go back, we have a field day. We just finished our field day in Almonds. There was 250 people there. Last year there was 350 people. So these are well-attended events, and we show them some of the data that we're seeing from their farms. And then by year three, we're hoping to start galvanizing the research community within each region and start hoping that we can start handing the baton off in particular food systems off to the locals in order to kind of continue this process going. So over the next 3 or 4 years, we'll be expanding. This year we'll be in the desert Southwest and along the Great Lakes, so we'll be coast to coast. and then we'll be on a national continental scale here. Most of the food systems will try to hit a lot of the dominant ones for sure. Yeah, by year 4 or 5 here, we're hoping to start globalizing this, and there's already been discussions on the strategy of that and how to do that. So we're looking forward to that. What are tangible ways we can fight against the corruption within ag industry and large corporation influences within the science? You know, in your change your life, I think is really what we have to do, and that counts for everybody, including myself, right? We have to realize what we're up against, and that the status quo isn't going to get us where we have to be. Find the people that are making changes in your community, because there's a lot of hope right now. There's a lot of people that are doing something. They're not just pamphleteers, they're not salesmen, they're doing something. Join them, help them. Those are ways of corrupting, or of fighting the corruption of this, is community and relationships. Really important. Any other questions from the farmers, or?
Yeah, just a question. What do you say to a farmer, southern Minnesota, raising corn, soybeans, whether he's a 1,000-acre farmer or even a 10,000-acre farmer? That's their market. That's what they're set up to do. That's what their equipment is. They don't raise livestock.
Yeah. What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, what's your suggestion to them?
Step 1, go no-till. Get covers, multi-species covers on the ground. Those are really important things. Step 1, we got to have that. Diversify your rotation. Get something else into that. The more you can extend that rotation, the more life you end up generating on your farm. Don't plant things you don't need. The seed treatments, get off of these things as quick as you can. You don't often need, if you're rotating your crops, you don't need a lot of genetically modified traits. That is costing you a lot of money. And it doesn't have a direct toxicological effect very often on the system, but it costs you a lot of money, and it's not really helping you in a lot of cases. Usually your system should be the one that does that. And then start developing relationships within your community. There's opportunities with people that do have ground or cattle or sheep or, you know, whatever livestock are in the area. Those would be some of the first things I would do. Real simple, and it works within your current system in a lot of cases. Have you found perennial orchard systems that have eliminated insecticides? Yes. So I was sitting at the table with one of our conventional producers and showed him the data, right? And in almonds this was, and showed him the data, and he's like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I did everything I was supposed to do. I followed the university's best practices. I followed the almond board's best practices. I sprayed insecticides 5 times. It cost me like $100,000 or something like that. And what you're telling me is that the folks right across the road from me that did not spray at all had the exact same number of pests as I did. And I just don't believe that. And I explained to him that it wasn't just that person across the road, right? That's why science is needed right now, is that there are that replication. It was all of the regenerative science, or farms that showed the same pattern. When they healed the soil, those pests didn't become a problem. So covers, really essential. Covering the ground, getting life into that system, really, really important. Yeah.
So you kind of touched on the crop insurance barrier, which has gotten better, I would definitely say in the last 3 years, but there's still some barriers in there. What
Yeah.
advice are for farmers to try and help move that needle, or what could they be doing to try and circumvent some of that and minimize their risk?
Well, so do it on a small portion of your acres, maybe. If you've got opportunities to say intercrop or involve diverse cover mixes or diversifying your rotation, you don't have to bet the whole farm on it this year. And then if you guys get yourselves organized and you find a number of folks, say in the Renville County Soil and Water Conservation District, are interested in the same question, we might be able to mobilize a scientific team to come out and study the impacts of that. And that might really help to provide data that indeed, some of these regenerative practices are in fact best management practices. The best crop insurance for your farm is regenerative agriculture, right? I mean, we shouldn't need a handout from the government to keep in business. And yes, I get it. In catastrophic events, that's true. But without that subsidy, folks wouldn't be growing corn and beans right now. And so the current, people often ask me, can you scale regen? And I ask them, if we don't have these supports for diesel or fossil fuels and crop insurance, you can't scale industrialized agriculture either. Conventional agriculture doesn't scale very well without these price supports. So I think we need to get our farms into a system where we're not relying on that crutch. That's scary, I get it, okay? But what it comes down to is diversifying the farm.
We lease out our farm. How the heck do we get involved in this thing then?
Could you repeat the question?
We lease out our farm, so we could be involved with several renters year after year after year. How the heck do we get involved in this thing to effectively get some results?
Landlords right now are extremely important. You need to restrict who runs your farm. I mean, you need to start saying, okay, so I understand, right? These are relationships you've had for a long time. They're good, clean farmers. They've been friends of the family. They're trying their best. That is your heritage. That is your legacy, is that piece of ground. And unless you're not taking an active part in restricting what practices are done there, then you're not going to have it. It's not going to be worth anything. A lot of this is, how do we change, right? How do we do that? This is scary. This is a lot. We're invested in the current system. Regenerative agriculture sounds great, but what's it going to cost me to change? I think that's the wrong question. Guys and gals in this audience, we're up against stuff we've never seen before. They have to come up with whole new names for weather patterns. Derechos? What the hell is that? We've never had that before, right? What's it going to cost you not to change? It's going to cost you your farm. It's going to cost you your grandkids. Is that worth it? It's not to me. Are we collaborating and coordinating with other national efforts? The Soil Health Institute's North American Rangeland Project sounds real similar to the Thousand Farms Initiative, but no, we're not directly contributing to that one. But we were on 88 rangelands this last year doing full systems assessments, and so we're hoping, again, this is where that consilience of evidence ends up becoming really important, having different research teams investigating similar questions. So we're excited to see the results of those. In other cases, we are, like the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, or UC Davis is working in almonds right now, or Driscoll's berries, or is interested in regenerative strawberries, or General Mills has been supporting a lot of the work that we've been doing in trying to transition their supply chain over to regenerative. So yes and no. Yeah, we're not collaborating with all of them, but we are collaborating with a lot.
So you had one slide with the almond trees and stuff, and you showed one side had green grass, the other was dead. What regenerative practices were implemented on one side?
Yeah, the biggest thing for them is covers. You know, they've got so much bare ground out there and it's just a desert. So getting the covers on, they did have to revise how they water, because in order to conserve water out there, they started using these micro drip lines. And so they just dribble a little bit of water into the trees. I mean, a stiff wind blows these trees over because the roots don't grow. But what a number of them do is micro sprays or solid state sprays, where it's got like basically a sprinkler. Man, having a combo of a micro drip and a micro spray, the micro spray gets that cover crop up and running, and then it takes off, right? And then the micro drip can then, or those drip lines can then water just the trees. It can really direct and conserve water. But boy, these almond orchards are in the middle of the Central Valley. They're using 30% of the water. And they're turning, as a result of SGMA, this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, they're turning off the water to a lot of the Central Valley right now. So all eyes are on this. It was interesting to see the difference in the field days last year. At our almond field day, there was 350 people there, but there was a lot of sniggering, right? Like, yeah, I'll never work down near Bakersfield or whatever. This stuff doesn't. I mean, they were there. This year, it wasn't like that. This year it was, how do we get this shit done? You know, and I've been so fortunate to be able to watch that change in the whole industry. It's really crazy what's going on out here. It's exciting. Some of those orchards also were grazing, so they have sheep in them. And they're applying compost and compost teas. Those are all good regenerative practices. I'll answer the question here about from Peaceful Belly. How is the Thousand Farms project looking at mental health outcomes in regenerative ag communities? Yeah, there's a reason that the farming community has the highest rate of depression of any career in the United States right now. I think they also have the highest level of suicide. If you're carrying $1 million in debt every year, my God, that pressure is just crippling. So regenerative farmers, we've just started on our management survey at the end of the year. We started asking questions like, would you advise your children or grandchildren or friends to farm the way that you do? That's a pretty telling question, right? Are you happy? 1 to 5. Real easy questions. But we're hoping to be able to also ask some of these questions indirectly, maybe by looking at satellite imagery and Maybe it's counting the number of trucks that are driving through a landscape, or maybe it's in association with these regenerative farms. Maybe it's the number of grain bins that have gone up. Maybe it's, you know, the number of swing sets in a yard. I mean, satellites are watching us all the time, right? So there might be some interesting things that we could tease out about that.
Our room is a little big, so it takes us a minute to get to them with the mic, so apologies.
Oh, no worries. I'm sorry. I hope you guys will invite me again so that I can actually meet some of you in person. I really apologize for having to do this on Zoom.
I'm putting some of the practices into my field, and I was wondering what are some of the best indicators showing that my fields are transitioning.
Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the hardest parts of my job, right? Because I could go onto a regenerative farm, and you guys get this. I can feel that it's different, right? With all of my senses. Maybe I'm hearing more birds. Maybe I'm getting hit with more bugs or something like this, or I smell the soil. As a scientist, I have to change all of those feelings into a number. I can tell you how I assess the quality of my own farm. Every day, I should go out to that farm and experience something that I've never seen before. And if I'm doing that, as a farmer, I can tell you that that's more accurate than any dipstick that I'm sticking in the ground and measuring, okay? If I've got that, I know that my farm is healthy and doing the right thing. Organic matter, life on your farm. You know, we all talk about carbon right now. In 10 years, nobody's going to talk about carbon. What they're going to be talking about is life. Address how much life is on your farm. Bugs, fungi, plants, birds, mammals, all of these things, right? You take care of the life, the carbon's going to take care of itself. Okay. The only way you get carbon is with life. And so measuring those things, at the end of 1,000 farms, what we're hoping is to have an app. You take a sweep net out in your field, sweep up as many bugs as you can, take a picture of it, and the app will identify it all for you. And you'll get an idea of how many species are out there. We're a couple of years off from that right now, but we just finished the first image recognition software, and it's working pretty well. So we're excited about that. What kinds of things are you doing?
I grow wheat for the first time, brought in no-till, using more like turkey litter and just different type of cover crop mixes and interseeding, just a lot of little things, and just seeing how it reacts with everything else.
What have you been seeing so far? Do you like what you're seeing?
I do. I just don't know what I'm looking at all the time.
Yeah.
Like you said, it does smell different. The ground takes the water better, but sometimes I don't know if I'm drowning my crop, or is it better or worse for what I'm doing? I know with soybeans, it's a no-brainer. You can't lose their wheat, as I've only grown the one crop, but that's done well. But corn has been a little tougher, and I know I made some of the mistakes that go against, conventional thinking, but you can't use conventional thinking either. So you're kind of fighting yourself all the time
Yeah.
on correct way to plant it and fertilize it, or get it to the way you want it. Because both times I had kitty litter, not kitty litter, that'd be tough. That's a lot of cats. But
Talk to my neighbor.
I got 9, and that's not enough. But right? But a lot of turkey litter, but is it in the right spot? Is it too much? Is it too concentrated? Because you're not mixing stuff up. Just a lot of little things, and you don't know every piece of the puzzle, if it's lining up, or are you just kind of making a mess?
Yeah. Man, I have so much respect for you in trying these things because there is no instruction book at this point, right? I mean, it's people like you that are making those changes that are going to make it so much easier for everybody else in that room. So thank you very much. And these observations that you're having are going to be what really wakes things up and help makes it, yeah. A lot of this stuff we've never seen before, right? And so it's really hard to give recommendations even at this point, but that's why we're doing the studies that we are. So ways to scavenge that water, getting covers on the ground. On our own farm, boy, livestock has just made a total difference, and just improving the cycling on that piece of ground, even if it's just winter grazing, I think it has a huge impact.
Okay, last chance. Any questions in the room? I don't want to cut anybody off if you're shy. Okay, well, again, Dr. Lundgren, thank you so much for your time, and I'll hand the mic over to Heidi here to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, everybody. I hope I get to meet you in person. Take care.